Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we slip gently into the enchanted world of Cinderella, a quiet tale of courage, kindness, and a touch of magic. If these nighttime stories bring you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now dim the lights, let everything fall still, and drift with me into this timeless fairy tale. There once lived a gentleman named Malcolm who kept a quiet life on a small, peaceful estate with his daughter, Arabella. Her mother had passed when she was only a tiny child. So though Malcolm carried many tender memories of his beloved wife, Arabella knew her only through the stories he shared. She was beautiful, clever, and dearly loved, he would say, smiling softly as he remembered how many young men had hoped to win her hand, and how fortunate he had been to be the one she chose. Arabella cherished these tales. They made her feel as though her mother still lingered close, even if she had never watched her daughter grow. Their home was a wandering old stone house, grand enough for a few guests, but never so large as to feel proud or cold. Arabella adored the house, especially its gardens, and most especially the quiet corner her mother had once tended with such joy. Her father always said that his bride had loved nature deeply and had spent countless hours choosing the flowers and little trees that made up her private paradise. To delight her further, Malcolm had added a graceful fountain, smooth stone benches, and an arbor where she often sat with a book for long, peaceful afternoons. Arabella inherited that love. Whenever she wanted a quiet moment to think, or simply to feel nearer to her mother, she slipped into the little garden. To her, it always felt gentler than any other place on the estate. Softer breezes, sweeter flowers, and the most curious little creatures flitting about. Sitting there, watching bees dance from bloom to bloom, or leaves drift into the fountain, she felt perfectly at ease. It was her calm refuge from the world. Their estate sat a short way from other respectable homes, and without a lady of the house, Malcolm seldom called upon neighbors. Arabella understood. Without her mother, the rhythm of visits and gatherings had simply fallen away. And so she learned to entertain herself, her days brightened by a loyal little dog named Henry, whose cheerful antics kept her laughing and whose devotion warmed her heart. Yet even with Henry's company, Malcolm sometimes felt the quiet weight of widowerhood. When Arabella turned 15, Malcolm began spending time with a nearby widow named Lydia, a proper, dignified woman with 2 daughters of her own. Agnes was 17, and Imogen nearly Arabella's age. They had been raised in all the customary accomplishments of young ladies, yet Arabella found their company a bit dull. She would happily speak of books or gardening, but they preferred whispers of local gossip. When she mentioned music, they drifted off into chatter about ribbons and dresses. She remained polite for her father's sake, though inwardly she wished they shared more common ground. She truly longed for close friends, so when her father gently told her that he and Lydia were to marry, Arabella worked hard to meet his happiness with a brave smile. The two had been each other's only constant for so long that she felt both joy and unease. She wished with all her heart for his comfort. Yet she could not help wondering what it might feel like to share her home and her quiet world with 3 women so unlike herself. Still, she congratulated him warmly, doing her best to feel hopeful. Weddings between widows and widowers were simple affairs in those days, and soon Lydia and her daughters were settled into the house. Although there were empty rooms to choose from, some shifting was unavoidable. Feeling it proper, Arabella offered her own spacious chamber to Agnes, who, as the eldest young lady, seemed to assume she deserved it. She swept in without so much as a thank you, scattering her belongings in a careless flurry. Arabella swallowed her irritation and focused instead on making her new, smaller room feel cozy. It had a charming window seat overlooking her mother's garden, and the furnishings had all been chosen long ago by her mother's gentle hands, comforts that soothed her more than fine space ever could. Imogen took the room across the hall, which soon became as untidy as her sister's. Dresses and shoes lay in heaps, jewelry tangled in careless piles, and not a single book in sight. She did not seem interested in knowing her new stepsister at all. While Imogen spent her days fussing with hair and outfits, Arabella kept to her tidy room, surrounded by neatly folded dresses and well-loved books. With 3 new ladies in the house, Malcolm's modest household soon felt stretched. Arabella had grown up with only 2 helpers: a kindly village woman who cooked their meals, and her daughter, Clara, a sweet, hard-working girl who managed the rest of the house. Without formality, the 4 of them had always lived in easy friendship. But Lydia and her daughters quickly made themselves comfortable, perhaps a little too comfortable. They summoned poor Clara to carry breakfast to their rooms, dropped their belongings wherever they pleased, and expected their things to be returned to their chambers as if by magic. They even insisted she help with their hair and gowns, though she was neither trained nor skilled in such tasks. Seeing Clara's struggle, Arabella quietly slipped in to help, mending troublesome seams, tidying what she could, easing Clara's burdens whenever possible. Yet Lydia soon began pressing Malcolm to hire a proper lady's maid, someone, she said, who could make her daughters look their very best now that they were nearing marriageable age. Malcolm, bewildered, did not quite understand the fuss. He and Arabella had always managed perfectly well. His daughter, he thought, had never needed a special maid. And to him, she had always looked lovely, just as she was. Still, he wished with all his heart to make his new bride content. On quiet evenings, he assured her that on his next trip into the wider world, he would inquire after a trained maid from the city, someone whose experience might finally satisfy her. This promise soothed Lydia for a time, yet she soon began pressing him to arrange his departure sooner rather than later. She could not, she said with a sharp little sigh, continue relying on a village girl to keep the ladies of the household looking properly refined. Whether Malcolm's announcement of a new business venture arose from his own ambition or from the constant nudging of his wife was never entirely clear to Arabella. But one evening, over supper, he told them that he would soon be setting out on an overseas journey. A trusted friend had urged him to join in a promising investment, he explained warmly. It might bring great profit, though he would have to travel far in order to make all the necessary arrangements. He expected to be away a month or two. Arabella said little for the rest of the meal, listening as her stepmother and stepsisters showered her father with requests for trinkets and rare gifts he might bring back across the sea. Lydia added a half-hearted sigh of sorrow at his leaving, though her thin smile betrayed how delighted she was that he would, at last, secure a new maid. Arabella, however, felt an ache settling into her chest. For months, she would be alone with Lydia and the girls. No gentle buffer, no father's laughter, no comforting presence in the halls. And beyond that, she worried about the running of the house. Who would make the final decisions in his absence? After dinner, father and daughter slipped away to her mother's garden for a quiet walk. Malcolm took both of Arabella's hands in his own, holding her close, looking straight into her eyes with deep and steady affection. He told her he trusted her completely, that he knew she was ready to see to the estate while he was gone. He would leave them ample funds, enough for even longer than he expected to be away. Though Lydia would be officially in charge, he admitted gently that his new wife had little taste for actual business. He was certain that Arabella, sensible and capable as she was, would keep everything running smoothly behind the scenes. Arabella's heart fluttered. She felt honored, but also suddenly aware of the weight of the responsibility he placed on her young shoulders. True, she knew the house as though it were part of her own memory. She was loved by the small staff, and from childhood she had learned her father's lessons in prudence and care. She was quick to understand, steady in her judgment, But even so, the task felt daunting. The day of his departure arrived sooner than she wished. Early spring clouds hung heavy and dark, and rain swept across the estate in restless sheets. A carriage waited near the steps as the women of the household stood clustered together, their shawls pulled up to keep the rain from their hair. After a stiff farewell, Lydia swept back inside. Agnes and Imogen hurried after her, relieved to be rid of the damp air. Arabella remained, pressing herself into her father's embrace, as though holding him tightly enough might keep him there. He stroked her back, comforted her gently, and at last she gathered her courage, stood tall in the downpour, and managed a brave smile. "Don't worry," she told him softly. "I'll take care of everything until you come home." He looked at her with a tenderness that warmed her through the cold rain, then climbed into the carriage and waved as it rolled away. Arabella stood on the steps until the wheels became a mere dot upon the long road. March storms softened into April breezes, and spring ripened into a golden, gentle summer. From time to time, a letter arrived from Malcolm, filled with tales of distant roads and foreign shores, some hard, some wonderful, all unexpected. In June, beneath skies as soft as silk, he wrote once more to say his journey must continue a while longer. He apologized deeply, sent warm assurances, and enclosed enough funds to support the household for 2 more months. The money arrived as a profound relief to Arabella, who had been quietly watching the last of the household budget thin away. But Lydia seized upon it at once, declaring that Agnes and Imogen were in dire need of new gowns. Even though the family lived outside the busy town, there was still a social season to prepare for, she insisted, and Agnes must be properly presented. Though timid to contradict her stepmother, Arabella felt she must try. Gently, she suggested that the staff needed to be paid. The pantry was nearly empty, and a man from the village was needed for repairs. "Would it not be wiser," she said calmly, "to see to those matters first?" Lydia's response was swift and icy. She informed Arabella that she, not a mere 15-year-old girl, would decide how the money should be spent. If Arabella worried so greatly over the cost of the staff, then perhaps Clara, the maid, could be dismissed, and Arabella could take on her duties herself. Agnes and Imogen burst into delighted laughter. "Why don't you start by cleaning the fireplace in my room?" Imogen jeered. "What a splendid idea," Agnes chimed in. "We could call her Cinderella." The name thrilled them both, and they eagerly whispered about all the tasks their new Cinderella might do. Arabella cheeks burning, left the room at once and hurried down the corridor, Henry trotting anxiously behind her. She fled to her bedroom, sank onto the window seat, and pressed her forehead to the cool glass. Looking down at her mother's garden, she whispered to Henry how unfair it all felt. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. Why couldn't her mother still be here? Why did father have to go so far away? She stroked Henry's soft fur until the deepening twilight lulled her into sleep. At dawn, her eyes fluttered open, and the very first thing she saw through the misted glass was Clara walking away from the house with her little bundle. Arabella tapped on the window, asking where she was going, though in her heart she already knew. Lydia had dismissed her, of course, redirecting Clara's wages toward new finery. Meanwhile, Henry scratched eagerly at the door, nudging her to rise. He pawed her cheek, wagged his tail, and tried to smooth her tumbled hair with a lick. Arabella opened the door just as Imogen stepped out of her own room, dressed smartly for the day. Her stepsister paused, took in Arabella's appearance, and smirked. "Well, look who it is. Cinderella," she said. "Mother has sent Clara away. There are chores waiting for you." With a faint, knowing smile, she remarked that Arabella might wish to dress in something more suitable for real work, and then swept away down the carpeted hall, her steps light and triumphant as she drifted toward the stairs. For a quiet moment, Arabella simply stood there, unsure what to do next, while little Henry scampered ahead, sensing her unease. At last, she chose the opposite direction, slipping down the lesser-used back staircase until she reached the warm, bustling kitchen. There, Cook stood in great distress, wringing her hands as though the world had turned upside down. The kind woman feared losing her position entirely, for Lydia was insisting she prepare the household meals and carry out all the chores that Clara once managed. Arabella, who had known Cook since childhood, went to her at once and wrapped her in a gentle embrace. She promised, with a soft and steady voice, that she would not let her struggle alone. Then, with a quiet resolve that surprised even herself, she lifted Clara's apron from its hook on the door, tied it firmly about her waist, and asked where she ought to begin. And so it happened that Arabella, once her father's cherished daughter, the young lady of the house, became a servant to her stepmother and stepsisters. Cinderella, they would call, summoning her without hesitation. Light my fire, wash my linens, press my petticoat. At first, Agnes and Imogen spoke with a hint of reluctance, as though some small voice told them it was wrong. But once they saw their mother's cold certainty, their own hesitation melted away. Their demands grew bolder, larger, heavier. They did less for themselves than ever before, piling task upon task onto Cinderella's weary shoulders, delighted, or perhaps determined, to bury her beneath them. To humble her fully, they soon called her nothing but Cinderella, as if Arabella had never existed at all. And, over time, the name settled into her thoughts like dust into an old corner. She began to believe it too. After all, the girl she used to be felt distant, like a memory fading at the edge of a dream. What else could Cinderella do? She had promised her father that she would care for the estate while he was away. Even now, though his absence had stretched far beyond what he had last written, she believed, deep in her loyal heart, that he would return. How could she possibly greet him by saying she had refused her duties, that she had let the household crumble? It would be unthinkable. She had been raised to honor her responsibilities, to stand firm even when the burden was unfair. And so she dusted, scrubbed, polished, swept, and tended every tiring, ordinary detail of daily life. She cleaned the very mirrors in which her stepsisters admired themselves for hours. The list of chores lengthened with each dawn, but there was no one left but her to complete them. Worse still, she feared what Lydia might do if she sought money to hire another maid. The coins her father had sent months before had long since vanished. Cinderella had noticed objects disappearing from the house: an old clock, silver pieces, even a heavy gold-framed mirror. If Lydia was selling her father's treasures piece by piece, how long before she took her mother's jewelry as well? Her father's precious books, her mother's keepsakes. That fear pressed on Cinderella's heart like winter wind, and so she worked not to please her stepfamily, but to protect the home she and her father had cherished. It was all she had left of her mother, save for the beautiful garden, as summer faded into the soft mist of autumn, and autumn surrendered to the quiet hush of winter. Cinderella found her rare moments of peace in that garden. She sat upon the bench beside her mother's hazel tree, watching the seasons turn. Her father had once carried the sapling home as a gift, telling her mother that the Celts believed hazelnuts held wisdom and inspiration. Her mother had adored the idea, tending the tree lovingly each year. Now Cinderella watched over it herself, admiring the pale yellow catkins in spring, and smiling at the tiny creatures who scurried to steal its nuts in late summer. Squirrels and mice darted like quick thoughts through the branches, stealing what they could. Their antics made her laugh softly, even on the hardest days. Yet the months drifted by, and then years, and still no word came from Malcolm. He did not return, and no letter bore his handwriting. Though Cinderella tried to keep her hope alive, a quiet fear seeped into her dreams. fear that he was lost forever, and that she was bound now to a life of endless toil under Lydia's unkind watch. And toil she did. For while cook continued preparing meals, almost everything else fell upon Cinderella's slender shoulders. Lydia continued selling valuables from room to room, and cook whispered of debts growing quietly in town. Thankfully, Lydia did not know where her stepdaughter had hidden her late mother's jewels, buried long ago in a small box beneath the hazel tree. Meanwhile, Agnes and Imogen bought whatever new dresses or trinkets they could manage. After adorning themselves, they rode out in the coach, visiting fashionable neighbors in hopes of receiving invitations, for each was searching, quite eagerly, for a husband. Agnes was now 19, Imogen 17. It wasn't only rumors that kept suitors at bay, though gossip certainly played its part. They lacked spark and wit, offering little charm, little music, little conversation. Without fortune or talent, they were simply unremarkable. And the bachelors of the region noticed. Cinderella was 17 as well, only weeks younger than Imogen. But there was no question of her entering society. Lydia was far too intent on parading her own daughters first, and Cinderella herself had no proper gowns left to wear. Though skilled with a needle, she had no magic to conjure new dresses out of nothing. Occasionally, Agnes tossed her an old gown with a careless sneer. "Here, I don't want this anymore." Cinderella altered them quietly for everyday use, but most of her garments grew shabbier with each passing month. Lydia, however, had begun to notice something unsettling. Even in her plain, worn clothing, Cinderella's beauty only grew more radiant. She had never been given dancing lessons or the polished manners of society girls, never been taught the little flirtations expected of young ladies at gatherings. But this lack of artifice made her all the more graceful, all the more lovely. Lydia hated it, hated that no matter what she took from the girl, some gentle light remained within her. Hidden though she tried to keep her, Cinderella seemed always to carry the quiet beauty of someone untouched by vanity. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a piece of news arrived that sent Lydia and her daughters nearly trembling with excitement. The king and queen, it was said, would be spending several months at their country palace nearby. An unusual occurrence indeed. Though the royal family owned many estates, they seldom visited most of them. But now they were embarking on a grand progress through the kingdom, for their eldest son had come of age, and since he would one day be king, his parents wished for him to see his lands, to know his people, and to meet the noble families who governed them. And thus, the first quiet breeze of change slipped gently into Cinderella's weary life. In every corner of the kingdom, the mothers of debutantes were alight with excitement. Everyone knew that the young prince, handsome, courteous, and finally of age, might soon be searching for a bride. And should the royal family arrive, there would surely be a grand ball. That meant every dressmaker for miles would soon be buried in ribbons and silk, stitching finery for the daughters of the region's proudest families. But in Lydia's household, one small shadow dimmed all this talk of splendor. There was simply no money left for gowns. Within an hour of hearing news of the prince's visit, Lydia and her daughters were tearing through room after room in a frenzy. For months, Lydia had been quietly searching for the jewels that once belonged to Malcolm's first wife. Now her craving to dress Agnes and Imogen in grandeur swallowed the very last of her decency. She flung open Cinderella's bedroom door and demanded to know where the missing valuables had gone. Cinderella, honest even when honesty hurt, lifted her chin with as much courage as she could gather. Softly, she told Lydia she had no idea what she meant. She hadn't seen her mother's jewels in years, she said. Perhaps her father had hidden them away somewhere, or sold them long ago. Lydia, certain the girl was keeping secrets, snapped at her to return to the kitchen. Cinderella slipped past her without a backward glance as Lydia and her daughters began tearing her little room apart, tossing linens and trinkets aside in their haste. Descending the stairs, Cinderella allowed herself the tiniest smile. They would never find what they sought. The jewels were safe, hidden deep in her mother's garden, known only to her. When the search yielded nothing, Lydia seized the key to Cinderella's bedroom. Then she turned her attention to Malcolm's beloved library. His most precious books, those he had collected over a lifetime, quietly vanished. In their place came a dressmaker, her arms full of shimmering fabric. Soon, the parlor lay buried beneath silks, laces, and rustling crinolines, while Lydia and her daughters chattered loudly over colors and styles. As the cook muttered, Lydia seemed determined to turn her two little moths into butterflies, though her tone suggested she doubted very much that it could be done. Watching her stepsisters twirl before mirrors, Cinderella could not help the soft ache in her heart. How she longed to go to a ball, to stand in a glowing hall, to meet a prince, to feel for one evening like she belonged in a world of brightness. Outside, the last warm days of autumn slipped away on a stormy wind, and cold gray skies settled over the land. Just as everyone expected, an invitation soon arrived. Lydia read it aloud at the door, while Agnes and Imogen hovered over her shoulders, squealing. From her place at the hearth, where she knelt cleaning the fireplace, Cinderella listened to each word. "The king and queen request the pleasure of your company," Lydia read proudly. The rest was drowned out by giggles. Cinderella understood enough. The ball would be soon, and she would not be going. On the day itself, Lydia and her daughters shut themselves away for hours, curling their hair, powdering their faces, and calling for Cinderella every few minutes. She pressed gowns, adjusted hems, pinned stray locks of hair, and repaired seams with quick, clever stitches. Her gift for needlework, which had once brought her joy, now kept her endlessly busy. At last, the borrowed carriage arrived. Lydia had convinced an elderly neighbor, who wasn't attending, to lend it. Agnes and Imogen argued all the way down the steps. Whose dress sparkled more? Who would speak to the prince first? Which ribbons were luckier? The coachman waited patiently as their voices rose and fell. But when Cinderella stood quietly on the stairs, he caught her eye and, just for a moment, winked kindly at her. The small gesture warmed her as the horses set off, hooves clattering into the distance. She wrapped her thin shawl around her shoulders and lingered on the steps. A cool wind drifted past her, tumbling a handful of leaves into the air. They rose, circled, and floated down toward her mother's garden. Yes, she thought softly. I'll sit there for a while. She walked down the path between the overgrown hedges, opened the small gate, and stepped into the quiet sanctuary she had always loved. The pond was beginning to freeze, and the hazel tree stood bare, its branches stark against the pale sky. She sat carefully on the cold stone bench. Moments later, her little dog, Henry, trotted into the garden, having wriggled his way out of the kitchen. He pressed warmly against her legs, tail sweeping the frosty ground. She murmured tender words to him, grateful for his company. As she stroked his soft fur, her eyes stung with tears. She missed her father, missed him more than she could bear some days. Life in the house had grown lonelier, harder. With only Henry and the cook as true friends, her future felt unbearably small. And tonight, her heart ached for a dream she could not reach. "Oh, Henry," she whispered with a weary smile, "I don't suppose you can conjure me a dress? Something new, something lovely." Henry tilted his head, but then his ears pricked sharply. He began to whine, staring past Cinderella at something behind her. Before she could turn, a warm glow spilled over his little face, and his whining melted into a joyous bark. Cinderella twisted around and froze. Before the hazel tree stood the shimmering outline of a woman, not young, yet not old, ageless, serene, wrapped in a gown of an earlier time. The fabric drifted around her like mist, and a gentle light surrounded her, warm as candlelight and bright as morning frost. She seemed scarcely bound to the earth, as though she floated upon the air. Henry sat silently now, tail curled around his paws, eyes wide. Cinderella could not speak, but the apparition did. "My child," the woman said tenderly, "your heart is troubled. You need not explain. I have seen it all." Relief washed through Cinderella like a tide. The lady's voice was soft, but sure, as though she had known her for years. "Your stepmother and stepsisters have been unkind," she continued. "Yet you have carried your burdens with grace. Though you did not know it, I have watched over you always. Through this hazel tree, through this garden your mother once cherished, and through the jewels your father gave her as tokens of love." At this, Cinderella's tears spilled freely. To be seen, to be understood, felt like a blessing she had long forgotten she could receive. "My dear," the woman whispered, smiling gently, "dry your tears. I have come to bring you gifts." She stepped aside, or rather floated aside, and motioned toward the branches of the hazel tree. Cinderella gasped softly. Hanging from the boughs was the most breathtaking gown she had ever imagined. Gold, shimmering from bodice to hem, its full skirt whispering in the wind as though woven from sunlight. Below it rested 2 delicate slippers, and on a far branch hung one of her mother's necklaces, a slender chain of diamonds and topaz. Cinderella blinked. That necklace should have been buried with the others. But there was no time to wonder. She rose to her feet, whispering her overwhelmed thanks, but then her shoulders fell. "Even if I had a dress, how would I get there? The palace is far, and our carriage is broken. I don't know the way." The lady's eyes sparkled kindly. "Do not worry, child. Leave everything to me." She lifted her hand through the air, and at once Cinderella felt the weight of the gown upon her, the soft clasp of the slippers, the warmth of the necklace resting against her collarbone. Her hair curled perfectly around her shoulders, arranged into a style she could never have created alone. Cinderella spun once, then again, the skirt rising and falling like a golden sigh. Joy lit her from within. The lady, pleased, turned toward the vegetable patch. 2 squirrels perched atop a great round pumpkin, eyeing it curiously, with a gentle flick of her wrist. A fine coach stood in the drive, gleaming in the fading light, hitched to 2 tall chestnut horses who tossed their manes as though waking from a dream. Cinderella gasped, her heart lifting like a lantern rising into the night. Just then, a bright little bark broke the quiet, and when Cinderella turned, Henry was no longer at her side. In his place stood a tiny coachman in elegant livery, smiling up at her as though they had been friends for years. With a cheerful bow, He motioned for her to approach the waiting carriage. Cinderella covered her mouth with her hands, half laughing, half gasping with delight. Dear Henry would be the one to take her to the royal ball, after all. Spinning back toward her shimmering benefactress, Cinderella poured out her gratitude, asking breathlessly how she could possibly repay such kindness. The glowing figure only laughed softly, warm as candlelight, and with a gentle sweep of her hand, eased the question away. Then, meeting the girl's bright eyes, she said tenderly, "My darling, I am your godmother. It is my joy to bring happiness to you. Tonight will be beautiful, but you must listen closely. When the clock strikes midnight, the magic will fade. The carriage will return to its pumpkin form. The horses will leap back into squirrels. The coachman will regain his faithful canine shape. And your gown will be the ashes-dusted dress you wear by the hearth. Be home before midnight, child, or you may find yourself in great difficulty. Do you understand?" Cinderella nodded with solemn care. She would not forget. And so her enchanted evening began. Henry the coachman offered his hand with courtly charm, guiding her gently to the step that led inside. The carriage itself was finer than anything she had ever imagined, far grander than anything her stepsisters could have begged or borrowed. Its warm brown panels shone like polished chestnut, set high upon slender wheels that glimmered in the lamplight. Lanterns glowing softly at the front and back cast a gentle circle of light, so the night felt no longer harsh, but welcoming. Cinderella slipped into the plush, upholstered seat with a heart full of wonder. Henry tucked a soft blanket around her, making sure she was warm, before climbing up onto the driver's perch. With a crisp click of his tongue, the horses, no longer shy little squirrels, but proud creatures, stepped forward eagerly. Cinderella managed one last grateful wave to her fading godmother, who seemed already to be dissolving into the moonlit garden. For a moment, Cinderella wished the vision might linger just a little longer. So much magic in so little time, it hardly felt real. But the night, once windy and cold, had softened into a calm sky full of shy, glittering stars. Nestled beneath her blanket, lulled by the gentle sway of the coach, Cinderella felt as though she were gliding through a dream. She hadn't traveled anywhere in years, and certainly never in such splendor. Though her thoughts shimmered ahead to the wonders waiting at the palace, she also wanted to savor each fragile second of this impossible journey. All too soon, the carriage slowed upon the long, curving drive of the royal estate. Cinderella had heard tales of this place, but seeing it was another thing entirely. More than a century old, the palace stretched outward like a great crescent of stone and light. A grand central portico rose proudly, flanked by tall towers on each side. Long east and west wings curved back like embracing arms. Cinderella found herself quietly counting windows, wondering how many rooms could be hidden behind them. Slender pillars lined the facade, and above every roof stood silent statues, guardians of past generations, watching the night's guests arrive. She drew in a steadying breath when the footman opened the carriage door, carefully placing one slippered foot and then the other on the wide steps. She turned back. Henry gave her a confident wink before steering the horses forward. She knew he would return in time to carry her safely home. Faithful Henry. How she trusted him. Lifting her chin, she gathered her courage and stepped toward the tall staircase. From the open doors spilled the warm glow of 1,000 low lamps and the soft, floating notes of a waltz. For just a heartbeat, she worried. Guests were being announced one by one. What would she say if her stepmother spotted her? But fortune guided her steps, and she slipped quietly past the crowd, disappearing into the ballroom before anyone could question her. Her invisibility, however, did not last long. Cinderella truly did not know how breathtaking she looked. Even without her extraordinary gown, her gentle beauty would have drawn every wandering eye. As she moved through the room, past the tables of glittering food, past the sweeping garlands, past the dancers spinning like falling petals, whispers trailed behind her. Who was this radiant stranger? Where had she come from? Her stepmother and stepsisters remained oblivious, preoccupied with their own ambitions. They watched the royal family seated at the front of the ballroom, the king and queen smiling graciously, and the prince, far more handsome than they had hoped. They whispered eagerly about how they might catch his attention. But the prince's attention was suddenly elsewhere. When Cinderella glided into the center of the ballroom, full of wonder and unself-conscious grace, the prince leaned forward. His eyes sharpened with interest. He summoned the dignified servant at his side and murmured a few quiet words. The man looked out across the room, finding immediately the young woman the prince meant. It was clear the prince would not remain seated much longer. Instead of summoning her, he rose and walked toward her. As he moved, the ballroom parted like a soft tide, guests bowing as he passed. When he reached her, Cinderella dipped into her deepest curtsy, eyes lowered to his polished shoes. "Your Royal Highness," she whispered. He lifted her gently, offering a warm smile. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Though she had not danced since she was a child, it did not seem to matter. His steps guided hers with quiet confidence, and soon it felt as natural as breathing. They spun and swayed as the ballroom blurred into color and light, the marble floor carrying them as if they floated. Time thinned and folded around them. Minutes slipped into hours, and still they danced without speaking of names. When the clock began to strike 11, the chime felt like a cold hand brushing her shoulder. Cinderella knew too well what it meant. She leaned close and told the prince softly that she would return in a moment. How could she confess the truth here in the middle of so many watching eyes? The prince bowed his head with gentle respect. "I will count the moments," he said. As he stepped back, the crowd closed eagerly around him, hoping at last for their chance to be introduced. But Cinderella, seeing her moment, slipped free of the ballroom. She moved quickly across the hall, her slippers whispering against the stone. Down the steps she ran, heart pounding, the cool night air lifting her gown like a breath of wind. Her time was slipping away, as she had quietly hoped. The carriage was waiting for her, lanterns glowing softly against the night, with Henry sitting proudly in the driver's seat. The footman eased open the door, and she slipped into the hushed warmth of the cushioned interior. A moment later, the horses moved off at Henry's gentle command, and the coach glided down the long drive as serenely as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Cinderella leaned back, a breath caught in her chest, her fingers brushing her still warm cheek. A tangle of emotions fluttered through her: joy, wonder, and the nervous tremble of being discovered. What would Lydia and her stepsisters say if they learned she had been the mysterious girl beside the prince all night? And how could anyone possibly believe the truth? The gown, the carriage, the friend who had turned into a coachman? The thought made her laugh softly, pulling the blanket up beneath her chin. It all felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. For a fleeting second, she imagined sharing it with her father, and her eyes shimmered with sudden tears. How dearly she wished she could. They reached the familiar driveway long before midnight. The house stood silent. Agnes and Imogen would certainly linger at the ball until exhaustion forced them home. The magic's final moments ticked softly around her as she stepped out, and wanting to hold on to its warmth, walked alone toward her mother's garden. Starlight trembled across the cold sky, and a faint wind murmured through the courtyard. She perched lightly on the stone bench, careful of the shimmering fabric of her gown, and touched her necklace with gentle reverence. Closing her eyes, she whispered her gratitude into the stillness. Gratitude for the fairy woman who had appeared so unexpectedly and turned one lonely evening into a memory she would cherish forever. In the quiet pulse of the necklace, she felt something tender and familiar, as though her mother's presence wrapped around her like a soft shawl. She felt, for the first time in years, truly unalone. There was no striking of a clock, only the soft sigh of midnight brushing past her. A small gust scattered the fallen leaves, and in that breath of wind, the enchantment slipped away. She found herself once more in her simple house dress, with Henry at her side, wagging at the empty space where the carriage had stood. A pumpkin rested calmly on the earth. With a small, resigned smile, she nudged it back into its patch. Henry whimpered, tilting his head. "Time for bed, my friend," she murmured, and together they slipped into the quiet house. In her room, she lit a tiny fire to keep away the bitter night chill, then crawled gratefully into her blankets. The moment her eyes closed, she saw nothing but swirling silk and the prince's warm, handsome face drifting through her thoughts. She must have fallen asleep at once, for when she next opened her eyes, sunlight was pouring through the curtains, and the house lay in peaceful silence. Sitting up with a luxurious stretch, the memories of the night before fluttered back so clearly that she hurried to the window. The neighbor's borrowed carriage stood just where it should, and the garden looked utterly unchanged. No gown, no coach, no fairy godmother, and no proud chestnut horses. Henry waited at her door, tail thumping. It was already 8. She had fires to light and breakfasts to prepare. Thankfully, Lydia, Agnes, and Imogen were still snoring loudly and would likely sleep away much of the morning. She hoped so. She had no desire to listen to their tales. Luck was on her side. The sun rose high before any of them stirred. Yesterday's gloomy skies had cleared into a crisp, bright day, and Cinderella felt lighter than she had in years. She hummed as she carried out her chores, unable to stop smiling at her secret. Perhaps she would never again attend such a magnificent ball, but the memory alone felt like a treasure. And more than that, she sensed a gentle, protective presence lingering in the house, as though her mother, or perhaps her fairy godmother, walked quietly beside her. When the other ladies finally rose, they were too busy gossiping to bother tormenting her. Cinderella listened as they breathlessly recounted the splendor of the ball and the mystery woman who had captivated the prince. They were deeply offended, of course, that neither had been granted a dance. Lydia scolded her daughters for expecting such attention, and reminded them that simply being seen among fashionable company improved their chances of attracting a respectable gentleman. Agnes and Imogen sulked miserably, then resumed whispering the moment she left the room. Life slid back into routine for a day or two, until another royal invitation arrived. A second ball. Agnes and Imogen went into a flurry of excitement. The dressmaker was summoned once more. More books vanished from Malcolm's library shelves to pay for new gowns. At dinner, Lydia declared that no young lady of taste should ever appear twice in the same gown at royal gatherings. And so the preparations began. It was said, whispered through town, that the prince hoped to see the enchanting stranger again. Naturally, the two awkward sisters prayed she would not appear, giving them another chance to shine. But even if she did not, there would be other gentlemen to charm, as their mother reminded them. Meanwhile, Cinderella was torn. She grew clumsy with her chores, lost in daydreams. A quiet part of her longed for her fairy godmother to return, to grant her one more night of magic. Another part of her warned not to hope too much. She decided she must expect nothing. Once had been enough, though her heart still danced whenever she remembered. At last, the day arrived. Lydia borrowed another carriage, this one merely passable, and Agnes and Imogen were more demanding than ever. Cinderella starched their skirts until they nearly stood upright, curled and pinned their hair, buttoned endless gowns. She barely had a moment to breathe, let alone to wonder if the night held anything for her at all. When the carriage finally rattled away with the three ladies inside, she pulled her shawl close and made her way toward her mother's garden. Henry trotted faithfully behind her, his breath puffing in tiny clouds. The air smelled of the first snow, sharp and cold. Pushing open the gate, she felt a small, foolish sting of disappointment to see the tree. Bare, no golden gown waiting for her this time. She scolded herself gently and sat on the stone bench, scratching Henry behind the ears. It had been too much to hope. Closing her eyes, she tried to think of happy things. She thought of the candlelit ballroom, the warm light glinting on the marble floor, the feeling of spinning weightlessly in the prince's arms. And when she opened her eyes, her breath caught. There, to her left, hung a shimmering silver gown, glittering softly in the branches. Beneath it sat a pair of matching slippers, and from an outer branch dangled a delicate silver and sapphire necklace, one she was almost sure she had seen among her mother's treasures long ago. Turning, she found her fairy godmother standing nearby, radiating a gentle glow, both present and scarcely there at all. Warmth spread through the garden like a soft sunrise. With a tiny gasp, Cinderella realized the magic had returned. The fairy lifted her hand toward the pumpkin resting in the patch, then toward the two birds perched in the hazel tree. In an instant, a magnificent coach shimmered into being, sleek and black, trimmed in gleaming silver, finer than anything Cinderella had ever seen. And her new adventure was just beginning. In front of it, a team of powerful ebony horses stood, each wearing a feather atop its headdress, once again grinning as if sharing her delight. Henry stood dressed in a livery that matched the coach, waiting for his mistress to be ready. Bursting with happiness, Cinderella spun in a circle, knowing that the dress would be on her in a moment as she completed her revolution. Its gauzy silver layers floated down gently around her, as if enveloping her in a dream. She put one white, gloved hand up to her neck and felt the weight of her mother's sapphire resting there, and her fingers touched the curls that cascaded elegantly about her head. She was ready, but her godmother had a warning to repeat. "Dear girl, do not forget that this magic will expire at midnight. Do not lose your head and stay too long, or you will once again be revealed in your rags. Your coach will be a pumpkin fit only for the pat. Your horses and your coachman will be birds and a dog. Keep your wits about you, and all will be well." Cinderella clasped her hands and nodded firmly. She promised her fairy godmother that she would not forget. Then she made haste, for she was thrilled with the promise of the evening to come, and she didn't want to lose a minute, and off the coach went, with the horses clopping merrily down the road, pulling their darling Cinderella towards the royal ball. Once again, the night was overcast with the promise of snow, and the moon peeked out from the clouds only from time to time. As the carriage sped towards the palace, white snowflakes began flying by the windows, visible in the light of the lamps at either end. It was a gentle snow, appearing with the lightest touch, as if to shyly introduce the winter once again. When the coach pulled up to the palace, the blazing lamps inside seemed even more festive than they had the last time. In contrast to the first bite of winter on the front steps, the entrance hall was a beacon of light. The darkness instantly melted away as guests crossed the threshold and were announced. Once again, Cinderella slipped by, briefly unnoticed. However, this was just barely, for her appearance in the entryway to the ballroom created an immediate stare. Decorum fell by the wayside when the ripple of excitement in the crowd reached the front of the room. This was where the royal family once again sat, presiding over the event. Forgetting his royal position, the prince involuntarily stood from his seat, his eyes burning a path across the crowd to the place where Cinderella stood, a silvery vision. For, of course, she had no idea that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. She was, in fact, the most lovely girl anyone there could remember seeing. Not only was her gown even more magnificent than the one she had worn before, but there was something new and luminous in her. She radiated hope, self-confidence. She was suffused with a certain something nobody could put their finger on. It could only be described as magic. 1,000 whispers could be heard as the prince walked straight toward Cinderella, who stood fixed in place like a statue. Upon reaching her, he smiled from ear to ear and bowed down, saying, "May I have this dance?" She couldn't hide her expression of delight as she accepted his hand, and he whirled her onto the dance floor as if they were simply picking up where they had left off, resuming their dance from the night when she vanished after the stroke of 11. Cinderella felt as though her feet were not even touching the ground. In that moment, she hadn't a care in the world, swept away by the music and the thrill of it all. She was brought back to reality only when the prince spoke to her. "We haven't actually been introduced," he said with a lopsided smile. "It's ridiculous, but I haven't even mentioned that my name is Edward." Cinderella had in fact known that his name was Edward. Everybody knew. What her mind was slowly registering, however, was that he was politely attempting to find out what her name was in exchange. Of course, she had mentally prepared for this unavoidable moment. If the gossip was true, he'd been eager to locate her a second time. In coming here, she'd resolved to somehow enjoy his company again, without revealing her identity. Because, truly, beyond the wrath she would experience from Lydia, what would he think of her if he found out who she really was? How could he possibly continue to see her, knowing of her humble position in a household that was fast ascending into debt? Fatherless girl with no fortune? No, she had vowed he would not discover her identity, and she would somehow avoid lying to him in the process. Smiling shyly, she looked down at her shimmering skirts, which floated around the pair as they danced in perfect time. Then, summoning a little bit of courage, she said, "I will tell you my name if you can guess what I call my little dog." At this, the prince laughed aloud. It was rare that any young lady had the courage to play such a game with him. Stepping with renewed vigor, he started trying out names. Spot? Buster? Captain? He offered. She shook her head with a sly smile. "Well, is it a girl or boy?" he asked. "You must narrow it down for me." Cinderella cocked her head to the side as they swayed back and forth. She felt that it wouldn't hurt her subterfuge to offer him this concession. "He is a boy," she said primly. At this, Edward gained a comical look of concentration. "Miles? Jasper? he continued. Narrowing his eyes, he added, I feel quite sure you are the type to have a dog named Jasper. Smiling indulgently, Cinderella shook her head. You are wrong, she countered. I had an uncle named Jasper, and I found him quite dull. At this, the prince grinned once again and swung her faster in a circle. In that moment, she felt she had never been happier. In her life, the riddle of her dog's name derailed Edward from pressing her for her identity. But she had another problem. Somehow, she had to create the notion that she might take a break on the veranda and still return to dance. With him again. After she'd given him the slip at the last ball, he was anxious not to lose track of her a second time. How could she slip out later? More than once, she begged a few moments to rest, making sure she didn't leave the room. During those times, while she sipped some punch or rested her feet, he was obligated to speak with other guests who clamored for his attention. When the clock struck 11, her heart sank. Just one more dance. Just 2 more dances, she told herself. There will be plenty of time. By 11:30, she knew she hadn't another moment to spare. She told Edward she would be taking a breath of air in the hallway. He regretfully turned to talk with other guests while she made her way into the tall, ceilinged foyer. Then, as quietly as a mouse, she slipped out the front door unnoticed. She made haste to her waiting carriage, where Henry tapped his foot in pain. On her journey homeward, she saw that the world had become frosted with white, with snowflakes flying wildly around them. Henry urged the horses to travel faster. As they moved quickly through the snowy countryside, he didn't need to say a word to his mistress. Cinderella knew that she had almost made a critical error by staying so late. She chided herself for her foolishness and hoped they would make it back before the stroke of midnight. Coach pulled up to a darkened house once again, and Cinderella had barely stepped to the ground when her entire carriage vanished, suddenly in her rags again. She turned to see Henry sitting next to the pumpkin. He barked at her as the 2 birds, once her beautiful ebony horses, flew off into the night. She stood still for a moment, catching her breath in the courtyard. It felt to her like everything was beginning to move too quickly. What had first been a fantasy for a single evening had turned into so much more. She realized with a sinking feeling that she had given herself over to the magic too much. She had allowed herself to hope for something better, for love, for another life. And now she couldn't take her heart back. She had already given it to Edward, dragging the enormous pumpkin back to its place in the garden. she slowly made her way up to her room. Once there, she shut herself securely inside, lighting a warm fire in the hearth. Comfort her, donning her nightdress. She slowly climbed into bed. It was too dark to see the snow falling outside, but she fell asleep. To the tapping of the little ice crystals as they hit the window in the darkness. She slept deeply and dreamed of dancing the morning dawn. Heavy, leaden skies. The world outside was coated in white, but to Cinderella, the monochrome landscape felt bleak rather than pretty. Her mood certainly matched the scenery. How could she face her real life after her enchanting second night with Edward? After the first ball, the prince had been more of an idea than an actual beau. But now, he was first and foremost a handsome suitor who had a maddeningly attractive sense of humor as well. The thought that she would never see him again was almost more than she could bear. Agnes and Imogen were likewise in a dark mood. Not only had the mysterious woman once again monopolized the prince all night, but they had also failed to land any decent potential suitors. Making matters worse, the royal family was scheduled to leave soon, making progress to another county where they would spend the rest of the winter. The two pouting misses took out their lack of sleep and their frustrations on Cinderella, petulantly demanding she complete all types of unusual tasks, and scolding her when they were not done to their satisfaction. Of course, satisfying them would have been impossible. They were unfailingly contrary, and nothing would make them happy. On that day, in the afternoon, while Lydia and her stepsisters were napping, Cinderella pulled on a heavy shawl and went outside, standing in the middle of her garden. The fountain was silent and frozen, and the branches of the hazel tree were coated in ice. Closing her eyes, she wished fervently that her fairy godmother would appear and offer some kind of comfort to her. But try as she might, she was not able to conjure the kindly apparition. For the first time in her young life, Cinderella felt alone in the little courtyard that had once been her sanctuary. A gust of wind whirled up the snow from the ground. She wiped away a tear. What good had the magic been if it had all come to nothing? Retreating to the house, she took advantage of the peace and quiet, falling into a heavy sleep on her bed. She awoke to a brighter day, feeling foggy, lying there, staring up at the ceiling. Cinderella realized that it was her birthday. She was turning 18, and she was quite sure that nobody would even remember. She rolled over and looked at Henry, happily wagging his tail by the door. "It's my birthday, Henry," she said. The dog whined quietly and stepped from foot to foot. Cinderella smiled at him indulgently. "You'll have to be my present today," she said. As she rose and straightened herself up while standing at her mirror. She noticed there was a bit of a commotion in the hallway. Imogen was calling down the corridor to Agnes, and they were discussing something in high-pitched voices. Cautiously opening her door, Cinderella stuck her head out to see what was going on. Her stepsisters were standing with Lydia between them, huddled over a piece of paper. Sensing her presence, all three of them stopped talking and glared at her directly. Lydia's voice drifted through the hallway, sharp enough to cut the quiet morning. "Cinderella, it's high time you showed yourself, you idle girl. Hurry with the morning chores, for we'll need your hands in the drawing room. There will be a third ball in only 3 days, and there's no time at all for new gowns. You'll simply have to make do and freshen the ones Agnes and Imogen already have." With that, the three women swept away, rustling down the corridor in a flurry of chatter, already busy plotting invitations and drafting a desperate note to yet another neighbor, begging the loan of their carriage. Cinderella stayed where she was, motionless in the long, echoing hall. 100 feelings pressed at her at once. Another ball, another chance to see Prince Edward. For her, it felt like the loveliest birthday gift her fairy godmother could have imagined. And yet, her heart wavered, for she knew how close she was to losing herself completely to someone who could never truly know her. Someone who, if he learned the truth, would surely turn away. She glanced down at her plain house dress, suddenly aware of her untidy hair, and imagined Edward arriving at her family's door, expecting to be welcomed. The picture shimmered for only a moment before dissolving. It was far too impossible to hold. With a soft sigh, she shook the thought loose and tucked it far behind her. Then she turned and made her way toward the kitchen, bracing herself for the long day. And she was right to brace herself. Even with all her skill and patience, she was no magician. It would have taken true enchantment to make her stepsister's worn gowns look new again. All afternoon, Lydia hovered and barked instructions, while Cinderella stitched lace upon lace, pinned ribbons this way and that, and adjusted seams until her fingers ached. By the time she was done, she had been given enough alterations to keep her busy right up to the night of the ball. When the morning of the grand evening finally came, the whole household awoke to a world buried in heavy snowfall. The sky poured white upon white, and Lydia, fearing the roads might soon close, hurried her daughters into the borrowed carriage and sent them off toward a friend's home in town. From there, reaching the palace would be much easier. Cinderella convinced Cook to start early as well, so she could travel home before the drifts grew too deep. And so, as the house grew quiet, Cinderella was left alone, with only Henry keeping watch at her side. It was peaceful without the sisters, but the gray afternoon stretched on endlessly. The estate seemed hushed and distant beneath the darkening sky. Curled in her window seat, her limbs tucked into a warm little nest, she let her thoughts settle. Yes, she would go to the ball. If her fairy godmother came one last time. And yes, she would dance with Edward again. Her cheeks warmed at the thought. Deep down, she knew he would seek her out. And when the night ended, he and his family would soon leave the county. There would be no more longing, no more dreaming. She would return to her life, grateful for the memory of a joy she had never expected to feel. Only one question troubled her. How could she hide her identity again? A part of her knew she was only pretending to be sensible, pretending she could protect her heart. Seeing him again meant risking everything, but she could not refuse the chance. When dusk arrived, she stepped outside. The world was wrapped in the softest silence, the kind that only falling snow can bring. Flakes drifted heavily around her, settling on her hair and shoulders in a matter of moments. She watched her footsteps appear in the untouched white, crisp, and bright. Henry padded beside her, leaving a second, much smaller trail of paw prints. At the gate, she pushed against the snowdrifts gathered around it, then stood perfectly still, letting the hush fold around her. She closed her eyes. She didn't breathe. She simply wished, with all the hope she had, that the magic might hold for just one more night. And then she felt it, like a sweep of tiny, shimmering crystals drifting over her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gasped. Hanging from the hazel tree was a gown unlike anything she had ever imagined. If someone had gathered the stars themselves and woven them into cloth, it could not have been more beautiful. It was not silver, but something brighter, something alive, a fabric spun from diamonds and light. The skirts floated softly, glowing whenever the faintest breeze touched them. On the ground below rested a pair of delicate slippers that looked as though they had been sculpted from glass, and perched on a branch nearby was a tiny diamond tiara, modest but sparkling warmly, a piece Cinderella recognized. It had belonged to her mother. Her mother would be with her tonight. Overcome, Cinderella turned toward her fairy godmother to offer thanks. But then her joy faltered. "How will I reach the ball?" she whispered. "The roads, they're nearly closed. Is it too late?" Her godmother laughed, a sound so light it chimed like crystal bells, and shook her head. With a graceful wave toward the snow-covered pumpkin hiding in the garden, she made a small flourish. In an instant, a handsome sleigh appeared in the drive, its runners gleaming like polished silver. A white rabbit hopped across the yard. Another flick of the godmother's hand, and it melted into a magnificent white horse, already bridled to the sleigh. And then Henry, faithful as ever, transformed as well, ready to guide her across the icy roads with noble elegance. Cinderella spun in a slow circle, hardly able to contain her delight. She could feel the starry gown settling around her, its shimmering weight like a dream. And over her shoulders, warm and soft, lay a cloak of deep, luxurious velvet, a final gift to keep the winter night at bay. Her hood, soft and generous, shielded her carefully tended curls from the blowing ice and drifting snow. A little tiara shimmered in her hair like a captured star. Henry helped her into the cushioned back seat of the silver and red sleigh, and then quietly took his place at the front. Cinderella turned toward her godmother, her heart warm with gratitude. She was not at all surprised when she received the familiar warning about returning home before midnight. "This night will be beautiful," her godmother said gently, though her voice carried a sterner note as she added, "But do not challenge the limits of the magic. Midnight is still its final breath. Stay too long, and trouble will find you. Be wise, and all shall remain well." Longing to begin the journey, Cinderella promised with solemn sincerity that she would be responsible. Their swift passage toward the third and final royal ball felt like drifting through a dream. Snow fell without mercy, a thick white curtain closing around the racing sleigh. Yet unlike the rattling, jolting carriage of earlier nights, this sleigh glided so lightly that Cinderella felt as though she were floating, wrapped in warmth, sheltered from the winter's bite. She watched the pale, ghost-like world slide past her. Everything looked unreal, as if she were traveling through a half-remembered tale. Her arrival could not come quickly enough. She was sharply aware that this night would be the last. Her final dances, her final smiles with Edward. Eagerness and sorrow tangled within her as she approached the moment she longed for and dreaded. When the sleigh swept to a stop at the steps of the palace, the footman straightened at once, impressed. The man who helped her down forgot his usual reserve and looked up at her with unguarded admiration. Even though her cloak still concealed most of her form, her entrance caused a gentle stir. She moved carefully up the wide steps, and another servant bowed deeply, ushering her inside. Capes and coats were being collected and carried to a nearby room, while guests were given a moment to tidy their gowns and hair before being announced. Cinderella made sure to note precisely where the cloakroom was, then slipped into the dimness near the ballroom entrance and quietly followed a family just as they were introduced. With a soft sigh of relief, she stepped to the side to gather her bearings, but remaining unnoticed proved impossible. A hush swept over the ballroom, followed by a faint, circling gasp as guests took in her radiance among all the fine silks and heavy velvets, all the ribbons and pearls. Her gown shone like something woven from moonlight, and she herself glowed as though lit from within. She turned timidly, nodding to the people who stared in wonder. And then she was saved. Edward appeared before her, equally dazzled, bowing deeply as he asked her to dance. If their previous waltzes had been enchanting, this one felt like a spell cast gently around them both. They glided together, eyes locked, moving as though drawn by an invisible thread. Their closeness remained proper, yet inseparable. When the music shifted, neither dreamt of seeking another partner. The prince seemed wholly unwilling to release her. With quiet curiosity, he asked why she always disappeared, without explanation. Cinderella had expected the question, and she knew she could only answer with gentle evasiveness. Calling upon the shield of a lady's privacy, she apologized and explained simply that she had been called away unexpectedly each time. Edward accepted the answer, though not without longing, and they drifted back into silence. Before he surrendered the topic entirely, he murmured, "I do believe you may be the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Her cheeks warmed at once. She looked up at him, at his sincere eyes and boyish smile, and replied softly that he looked very fine himself. They danced on, wrapped in their own small world. After a while, he asked when she might finally tell him her name. Teasing, she replied that since he was so poor at guessing, she would tell him what she called her little dog. And if he asked her again after midnight, perhaps he would discover her true name. "Well then," he said eagerly, "what is your dog's name?" "Henry," she declared. He answered with mock skepticism. "I must admit, I think Jasper would suit him better." They both laughed, and he spun her a little faster. Soon he asked again, "Tell me something, anything, about yourself. Do you play the piano?" Cinderella shook her head. "I fear that if anyone wishes to hear a piano in my presence, he must be the one to play it," she answered with gentle solemnity. Edward seemed delighted rather than disappointed. Then he asked what kind of books she enjoyed. Her eyes brightened. "I love to read. My father has had a great many books. I like histories, poetry, truly everything. Edward grinned. Histories are my favorites too. I long to see the world in all its wonder, to go adventuring. His gaze drifted to the king and queen seated upon their thrones. But such freedom is not quite mine to have at the moment. Cinderella nodded with understanding as they continued to glide around the room. Then, with a wistful tone, he begged her to tell him just one more thing, anything at all. After thinking a moment, she said softly, "Last week was my 18th birthday." Edward brightened instantly and wished her a heartfelt happy birthday. A flutter rose in her chest, and she looked down as if studying her steps. Both wished silently that the night could stretch on forever. But time, even enchanted time, does not yield. Cinderella knew the moment would soon come when she would have to break her own heart and leave. She told Edward she needed a breath of air in the foyer, since the balcony lay buried under snow. Her plan had been to slip into the cloakroom unseen. But there, in unfortunate coincidence, stood Agnes, clinging awkwardly to the arm of a young gentleman. They blocked the door entirely. Cinderella lingered in the foyer, waiting, pretending to cool her flushed cheeks as she waved lightly toward Edward across the room. Minutes stretched painfully. Finally, 5 long minutes past the half-hour before midnight. Agnes released her captive escort, and he fled back into the ballroom. Cinderella seized her chance. She slipped through the cloakroom door, found her coat, and drew the hood up over her hair. Moving with calm purpose, she crossed the foyer and headed for the front door. Henry waited at the base of the steps with the sleigh. She quickened her pace, but halfway down the stairs, her foot slid slightly. One delicate slipper slipped free, lodging itself in the fresh snow. The footman called out, rushing to assist her, but she dared not stop. Not now. Not with so little time left. The slipper had to be abandoned. She fled toward the sleigh, skirts and cloak billowing as she climbed in. In an instant, the white horse surged forward, towing the sleigh effortlessly across the snowy grounds. As the palace faded behind them, Cinderella risked one last glance. The footmen were gathered on the steps, holding the lost slipper high, clearly baffled. For a third time, she had vanished from the ball, this time by the narrowest margin yet. During their flight home, the snowfall finally ceased, and the moon slipped out from behind the clouds. The world lay still and gleaming as though urging the sleigh onward, whispering, "Hurry, hurry, do not linger." They nearly reached the house, almost, but not quite. At the front gates, the magic dissolved all at once. The sleigh vanished. Cinderella tumbled softly into a drift of snow, dazed. She lifted her head just in time to see a white rabbit dart across the moonlit lawn. Henry sat nearby, shaking ice from his fur. Cinderella remained for a moment in the cold snow, unmindful of the chill. She glanced at the plump pumpkin beside the gate, then pushed herself up. Only when she climbed the front steps did she notice something strange. Her fine cloak had vanished. Her gown had returned to rags. Her tiara was gone. Yet one slipper, one miraculous slipper, still clung to her foot. Astonished, she removed it and held it tenderly in her palm. She did not understand how the magic had spared it, but she knew she would hide it dearly, where no one could take it from her. Stepping into the dark house, she went straight to her room and slipped beneath her covers. Sleep claimed her instantly. Deep, heavy, dreamless. She awoke late the next morning to a world transformed. Sunlight danced across the snow outside, filling the old house with brightness. Cinderella rose slowly and moved to the window seat. Below, she saw signs that Lydia and the stepsisters had returned sometime in the small hours. It must have been a long, weary journey home, confirmed by the utter silence lingering in the hallway. The house was still wrapped in sleep, every room quiet, every window dim. It would be hours before anyone stirred. In her little corner, beneath the eaves, Cinderella turned softly, and her gaze drifted to the tiny, delicate slipper resting upon her dressing table. What a marvel it was that the shoe remained at all. She wondered, in the slow and dreamy way one wonders at dawn, what part of the magic had faltered that night. Why had this one small treasure stayed behind? Perhaps it was because she had lost its twin at the palace. She could not unravel the mystery, but she cherished the slipper nonetheless, tucking it gently beneath the table as a keepsake of what she knew would forever be one of the loveliest nights of her life. Henry watched her from the doorway, his tail wagging with quiet understanding. There would be, she told herself, many days ahead filled with thoughts of Edward. But for now, the cook would be downstairs needing help, and morning duties could not be ignored. As always, her stepsisters rose in the late afternoon, drifting lazily into the parlor, where they gossiped and fretted about the happenings of the ball. They were annoyed, deeply annoyed, that the mysterious young lady had once again danced every dance with Prince Edward. "To think," Agnes huffed, "that we were there 3 times and never once met him." Imogen sniffed, as though bored by the whole matter. His dancing was tiresome anyway, she claimed. Perhaps it was for the best. In the corridor, Cinderella dusted the portraits and hid a small smile. Her stepsisters, she knew, would soon need to rely on country visits again if they hoped to meet any suitable young gentleman. Lydia would be in a foul temper for days. The snow began to soften under the midday sun, and when morning came again, the world shimmered as though dipped in glass. Icicles hung from every eave and branch, and the drifts were no longer deep enough to deter travel. So when a grand, gleaming coach approached in the late afternoon, the household hurried to the windows in astonishment. Their surprise only grew when Prince Edward stepped out, followed by a proud footman carrying a sparkling slipper. Agnes and Imogen rushed to the mirror, hastily pinching their cheeks and patting their hair. There was no time to change. They were already late in receiving him. But Imogen had a thought as they climbed the stairs, and she swiftly pushed Cinderella into her own cluttered chamber, locking the door from the outside to keep her out of sight. Cinderella beat her hands against the door, confused and insulted to be trapped in so messy a room. But downstairs, Lydia dragged the cook up to unlock it, determined to keep appearances that she alone was the servant in residence. Once the charade was done, the footman announced their purpose. They were visiting every home in the county where an 18-year-old debutante lived. They carried the slipper of a young lady who had vanished from the ball. Its rightful owner must be found. At this, Imogen stepped forward eagerly. She was, after all, the only visible 18-year-old in the house. Edward's expression faltered at the sight of her. Surely this was not the graceful young woman who had won his heart. Yet Imogen pressed on, claiming sweetness, sorrow, and ownership of the slipper. Lydia urged her to try it on. Agnes snorted. Imogen's feet were far too large. But before the prince could object, a chair was brought, and Imogen sat with tremendous airs. The footman knelt with patience, wriggling, knocking, pressing, adjusting, until, through some miracle, Imogen's foot squeezed in, bent, and cramped as the slipper was. "See," she declared brightly. "It was made for me." Edward looked faint, but before he could respond, a small dog bounded down the stairs. He darted past flowing skirts and landed before the prince, carrying another slipper in his teeth. Edward stared. The perfect match. Agnes, Lydia, and Imogen realized the truth at once. Cinderella. The mysterious girl was Cinderella. Imogen lunged to seize the shoe, and a ridiculous tug-of-war with Henry ensued. Agnes dissolved into helpless laughter. But the name Henry mattered most, for Edward recognized it instantly. It was the name the girl he loved had whispered to her dog. He demanded to see the other 18-year-old in the house. Lydia insisted there was none, only a servant girl. But it was already too late. Agnes, whether out of spite or sudden kindness or clever foresight, hurried upstairs and opened the locked door. Cinderella appeared on the stairway, dressed in her humble rags. In that breathless moment, everything shifted. Edward's face lit with joy. Cinderella stood tall, no longer hiding. Lydia readied herself to feign affection. Imogen scowled. Agnes looked strangely peaceful. And the cook and the footman watched with quiet satisfaction. Henry broke the silence, bounding to his mistress. Edward moved toward her, and the two met as though the world had finally righted itself. They were given the parlor, and Lydia withdrew with hopes of forgiveness. When Cinderella explained her simple life, Edward only smiled. He cared nothing for wealth or status. If she could accept his poor taste in dog names, he told her gently, he wished her to be his wife. She loved him, so of course she said yes. But Edward suddenly paused, looking troubled. "I have just realized," he murmured. "I do not know your name." Cinderella smiled softly. "My step-family calls me Cinderella, but my true name, the one my mother and father gave me, is Arabella." He whispered it like a vow. Arabella. A week later, she gathered Henry and her few belongings, returning to her mother's garden one last time. Beneath the soil lay a small box. She opened it tenderly. Topaz, sapphire, the tiara, and her mother's wedding ring. She held the ring to the light and decided she would wear it on her wedding day. At the palace, seamstresses surrounded her when Edward arrived with a surprise. He stepped aside, and there stood Malcolm. Father and daughter fell into each other's arms, overwhelmed with joy. He explained the long delays, the lost ship, the impossible journey home. Edward had sent men, searching, asking, tracing clues to bring Malcolm back. It was the greatest gift he could have offered his bride. Arabella apologized for not managing the estate better, but her father insisted she had done brilliantly. Lydia, he said quietly, had let too much fall on her shoulders. As for Agnes and Imogen, Arabella chose kindness. Times were lean, and Lydia was still Malcolm's wife. But the stepsisters would be given a chance to redeem themselves. Each offered a place at the palace, though not in Arabella's personal service. And so, with gentleness and forgiveness, the last notes of her old life faded. Her new one, bright, warm, and full of promise, was only just beginning. In the end, letting old hurts drift away is never as simple as saying the words. And yet, both young women felt a quiet tug toward a gentler beginning. It was a doorway to a different life, just as Arabella had wished for, one shaped by grace rather than bitterness. And so, Cinderella allowed the shadows of her past to fall behind her. No fairy tale would be complete without a soft glimmer of its happy ending. And you may rest easy knowing that Arabella and her prince found theirs in full measure. Their shimmering wedding became the talk of the entire realm. The loveliest guests gathered beneath lantern light, and when the celebration was done, the newlyweds wandered the kingdom together, Arabella winning the hearts of every village and valley they visited. Prince Edward, too, grew close to Malcolm, whose wisdom was far richer than any coin purse. The two spent long hours trading stories and marveling at the strange and beautiful corners of the world. And their quiet respect for one another warmed Arabella's heart more than she could ever say. You may wonder whether the fairy godmother ever returned. And of course, she did. Not always as a figure one could plainly see, but as a soft breath of air on a still evening, or a few tender notes of music drifting through an empty hall. Arabella felt her presence everywhere, even when her travels carried her far from the cherished garden her mother once tended. The little shimmer of magic followed her like a companion, reminding her that she was never truly alone, that a mother's love and a godmother's blessings can linger long after their footsteps fade. And so, with that gentle guidance, she learned each day to shine with beauty, both within and without. And rest assured, Cinderella and her prince, without question, lived happily ever after.